Hello and welcome to MATRI-X. Today we're going to be talking about spray grain. And the spray grain we're going to be talking about is a water-based spray grain. Spray grains can make or break a repair. When you emboss a grain onto a piece of vinyl or leather, there is a little difference or possibly a halo between the two grains. A water-based spray grain can make the difference. What it does is it blends between the two grains to where you don't notice the migration. There's three ways to apply it. The first way is the aerosol, the pre-valve. The second is an airbrush or a paint gun. The third way is a mouth atomizer. The differences are the mouth atomizer will apply a little heavier spray grain than the other two processes. The airbrush or the paint gun will normally apply a very fine grain unless you drop down the pressure. Then you can speckle it like you can paint. Alright? The most common way is the pre-valve. This is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be showing you a couple of options with using the pre-valve. Since we're going to be talking about the pre-valve, I want to talk a little bit about the problems people have. We have a lot of people who apply water-based spray grains but do not like the pre-valve. I live by the pre-valve. I go through a case of 100 at a time. So one of the things I want to talk about is when you're using a pre-valve and you're bending over or you're shaking the spray, in other words, you're moving like this to spray it, what you can get is propellant. And the propellant will clog up the interior of this because it freezes your spray grain. Not only that, it gets into your spray grain, changes how it works. So whenever you're using a pre-valve, if you read the instructions, there's instructions here. It says never go over 30 degrees, which is about this point, especially when they're new. But if you're moving around like this, if you're trying to spray, you can see all that propellant coming out. Be very careful of that. It can cause you a lot of problems. The number two problem is the tips here. The tips get clogged up. One thing you can do to prevent that is get a little bottle of water, put a lot of tips inside of it, swap out the tips in between spraying. That way you always have a fresh tip, your spray grain is working correctly. The third thing you can do is you can get one of these alcohol sprayers that have a concave tip. The inside of this can actually fit inside. And what this does is you can force through cleaner through it. This way you can keep the inside of this clean. If it's clogged where this is not pushing it out, then you can get one of these little piano wires or reaming wires. If you're using these, don't push it in, screw it in. If it's too big of a tip, try another one. But only don't do a lot of pressure, just screw it in like this if you're going in. Okay? It should go all the way in and out again. On the top you do the same thing. Just screw it in. Bring it in, bring it out. This way when you're spraying it again, you'll find it'll spray better. Then at the end, just make sure it's clear. See, it's spraying well. So that's a little bit about how the pre-valve works and how you clean it out. Now let's go through a couple examples that I did in the field. And I'll explain a little bit about my techniques. All right, here we go.
Alright, this is the back of an RV seat. That's a pretty large hole. I repaired it, and if you notice there's a halo right there. Well, we need to get rid of the halo. I used a solvent-based dye so I can iron a grain over the top of it. So make sure you use a thermostat-controlled heat gun. If you overheat it, you could cause damage. Once you've ironed it and cooled it off, you can remove the grain that you embossed. Now what you need to do is blend between the two grains. So here what we did is we're applying a spray grain to blend between the two grains right here. Now you may need to apply it 2 or 3 times before it covers up from one grain to the other. But if you do it properly when you're done, most people will not notice the repair. So the first technique is use a spray grain and lacquer-based dye. Use a grain, iron it on. Here's before and there's the after. So you iron on the grain, and then you apply 2 coats of spray grain. Here's a dog-ear tear. Now I'm embossing a mesh over the top of it. Now I'm going to use this mesh to help the grain. If you notice right there, you can see the mesh through the vinyl after it's been dyed. This is how I'm applying the spray grain. I'm doing a nice even pebbly effect, and this is the after. So it's really nice. There's the before. So that's a very simple way. This is a BMW, very common. This is a cold process, not a hot process. So we're going to be sanding this repair smooth. So now we have to progress between a smooth surface and a textured surface. So what we'd like to do this time is build up between the smooth surface and the textured surface by applying several grains over the smooth sanded surface. Now in BMWs, they have a little heavier grain. So a technique that I use to apply a little heavier grain is I will use a heat gun. And you notice how I'm doing little bursts of spray grain? What this does is it dries instantly and applies a little heavier pebble effect. Now on a BMW, if you left it as a pebbled effect, it would look different. It would look kind of pebbly where you did the repair, and everything else would be a nice even grain. So one of the tricks that I use is I wet sand it. I get our Excel cleaner and I sand down the whole surface. Then you wipe up all the excess, spray another coat when you're done, and I do this new car warranty for service departments, and I haven't had a complaint yet. And what this does is it blends the 2 grains together to where they really look nice. Again, your before, and there's your after. All right, let's get to the next technique. This is also an RV, and that's a wide open gap. And what I'm doing is I'm going to use the mesh to help pull the gap back together again. Now, on this particular surface, if you look closely, which I brought the camera up close so you can see this, there's a bunch of little craters and loose material in there. So if I applied a spray grain onto it, it would never really cover properly. It'd always look a little rough. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my finger and I'm going to rub in the grain. This way it's going to fill in all the nooks and crannies, as my parents used to call it, the imperfections. And here I'll bring it up close so that you can see how now it's all smooth. You see me in the upper right hand corner videotaping it. It's a smooth surface now. Now take a look at how I'm applying the grain. All I'm doing is I'm applying a nice fine pebble grain over the surface because this is a fairly light grain. Once you get a grain about like this, which is a nice surface, you have to dye the vinyl. Once the vinyl is all dyed, then what I do is called dry sanding. This is, you're not using any moisture at all. You're not using the Excel. You're doing a dry sanding. This is with 600 paper. Both times when I'm sanding, whether it's a wet sand or dry sand, I use a 600 paper. So here's a little tidbit for you. If you use a CO2 tank, you do not have to run a hose inside your $200,000 RV. All right, those are very simple techniques to show you. So now what I want you to do is there's your before, here's your after, and get out there and practice spray graining. And thank you. That's the end. Bye-bye.